I think I'm owed a piece of this. That is roughly what one co host told the founder of a podcast and its network after he had co hosted the show for only a couple of years. No contract, no conversation about ownership ever, just an invitation to join the mic that quietly turned into something much bigger. It all started at the exact moment things were finally going well. The show was on the verge of real money, sponsors circling, monetization within reach, and the co-host and the founder disagreed on how to actually do it. That disagreement didn't stay a disagreement. It escalated into that co-host asserting control over the show's direction and eventually trying to move the entire thing to a new network and cut the founder out. Not a hypothetical situation. It's a real case from my own practice, and it played out about the way you'd expect once the lawyers got involved on both sides. About a year of hard-fought negotiation, threats, saber rattling, legal bills piling up, and ultimately a settlement that left everyone, well, a little bit unhappy. And worse, the show sat dark for most of that year while this dispute got itself worked out, which meant that the revenue everybody had been fighting over never actually showed up. Zero, zilch, nada. Audiences drifted. Some found better other shows, competing shows, and never came back. And even after the settlement, rebuilding from a dead stop took real time and real effort. What makes that especially painful is that the co-host's claim wasn't entirely frivolous. Contribution, not paperwork, is often what the law will actually take a look at. And a couple of years of consistent, visible involvement is exactly the kind of thing that can support a real claim, contract or not. That's one side of a problem that I see over and over again, podcasters running into it as they build their team. And the other side goes the opposite direction. Paid help and things that you paid for assume that you own, but you might not. So today we're going to cover both. So stick around. I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and this is Legit Podcast Pro, the show that helps podcasters build businesses that are worth building. Not just content worth watching, but businesses that are worth building. So today, we're talking about the kinds of legal risks that show up as you build a team around your podcast. And I mean team more broadly than you probably are thinking. Most podcasters think of their team as the people that they hired: an editor, a virtual assistant, maybe a producer, people with an invoice attached to what they're doing. That's half the picture. The other half is everyone who's contributed to the show without ever being formally hired at all. A recurring co-host, a friend who became a regular voice on the mic, a collaborator who just started showing up and sort of never stopped. Well, both groups create real legal exposure. And that exposure runs in multiple directions. And that's what makes this genuinely easy to miss. With the people that you hire, the risk is that you might not own what they created for you. And with the people who joined organically, the risk is that they might own more of what you built than you ever intended to share with them. This is exactly the kind of the gap that my Creator Business Protection Blueprint is built to help you find. A way to look at everyone with a recurring role in your show and see honestly what's documented and what isn't. If you're building any kind of a team around your podcast or your YouTube channel or really anything you're doing, whether it's formal or otherwise, it's worth 10 minutes to have a look at this blueprint. You can find it at gordonfiremark.com. That's GordonFiremark.com/blueprint. So let's start with the people you actually hire and pay. Almost every podcaster makes the same assumption. I paid this person, so I own what they made. It's a reasonable assumption. It seems logical, but legally, it's often not quite right. See, there's a concept called work made for hire, and a lot of people have heard of it, and almost nobody understands it fully and correctly. It is a narrow legal category. It applies automatically when an employee creates something within the scope of their job. An employee creates something within the scope of their job. It doesn't automatically apply when the person is an independent contractor. And that's what most editors, VAs, freelance producers, writers, and so on really are. Now, for a contractor's work to count as a work made for hire, then the work generally has to fall into a specific limited list of categories, and there must be a signed written agreement saying that it's a work made for hire before the work gets done. Now, most podcasters don't have that agreement. And that means that the actual default rule kicks in instead. The person who creates something owns it, unless they've signed away those rights to you in writing. Not because you paid them. Ownership and payment are two completely different legal questions. And a lot of podcasters have never had a reason to learn that till it starts costing them something. I understand why this feels counterintuitive. In almost every other context, when you pay for something, it means you own it. At least the item, the article, right? You buy a chair, you own the chair. You buy a book, you own the book. Well, you own the physical copy of the book, but not the words on the page in the book. It doesn't matter, and it doesn't work that way with creative work made by an independent contractor. You see, copyright law treats the person who actually creates something, writes it, designs it, records it, edits it, as the owner from the moment it's created. Full stop. Regardless of who's footing the bill. The only way that changes is if the creator signs it away. Payment obligates them to deliver the work to you. It doesn't by itself transfer ownership of the work, the copyright in the work. So think about what that covers. Show templates, custom graphics, edited audio files, in some cases, original music written for your show, branding elements that a designer might have put together for you. If a contractor made any part of it and you've never had them sign an agreement assigning those rights to you, there's a real chance that they own it and not you. Now, I've talked with podcasters who found this out the hard way. A VA, for example, builds out an entire content system for a show, templates, workflows, branded assets, and over the course of a year or two gets paid consistently and fairly the whole time. Then that VA leaves and starts something strikingly similar for her own self. The podcaster's first instinct is, hey, I paid for all that. But legally, that instinct may be wrong. Payment for services rendered doesn't automatically transfer full ownership of what was created. The assignment clause does. And if nobody ever put one in writing, well, then there's nothing to point to. Now, the fix here is genuinely simple, and that's part of why it's frustrating when it's missing. Every independent contractor agreement you use for editors or VAs or designers, producers, whatever they may be, needs a clause that explicitly assigns ownership of anything they create for the show to you. Not implied, not assumed because you're the one paying the invoice. Written and signed before the work starts. Now, if you're already using some kind of a contractor agreement, this might be a single paragraph that's missing. Not an entirely new document. You just need to add a paragraph. And if you've been operating on emails and verbal understandings, well, it's worth building this agreement now. Maybe even backdating and trying to do some retroactive stuff. And you want to definitely do it before your next project starts, next episode, whatever it is, rather than after it's done. Because once the work exists, now you're negotiating from a weaker position than you would have been beforehand. And actually, now that I think of it, I think negotiating strategy is something we'll need to cover in its own episode because the relative strengths and balances of things in negotiation is really an important consideration. But we'll do that again another time. So right now, let's talk about the other side, the people who never got hired at all. This is where the story from that cold open comes in, and it's worth sitting with because it's the part that most podcasters don't see coming. That co-host, a recurring collaborator, someone who just started showing up on mic. These relationships often begin with no formality, no contract, no conversation about who owns what, no discussion of what happens if things don't work out. Just a, hey, come talk with me, come be on the show. And then months or years of consistent involvement follow. The legal problem is that consistent, visible contribution could support real claims to profits, to decision-making authority, even to the show's name and brand, regardless of whether anything was ever put in writing. Courts will look at things like conduct of the parties. If someone has been publicly presented as a co-owner of the show, has had a genuine hand in decisions and built up their own audience connection through the show, we never signed anything isn't automatically an airtight defense that podcasters might assume it is. There are a few other different legal doors that this kind of claim can walk through, depending on the facts, like an argument that an informal partnership existed based on how the two of you actually operated, or a claim that it would be unfair for one person to keep all of the value when both people were clearly involved in creating it. The specific legal theory matters less than the underlying point. None of these required a signed agreement to get started. What they require is evidence of how the relationship actually functioned and a couple of years of co-hosting, joint decision making, public association with the show. That's exactly that kind of evidence that you need. And if you don't get something in writing that changes the way that's viewed, you got a hard problem. Now, in the case from the cold open, that's exactly what happened. Two people building something together, no formal structure, no agreement about ownership or control, and it worked fine right up until the show got close to making real money. And then they disagreed about how they were going to monetize. That disagreement had nowhere to go because there was no agreement establishing who actually had the final decision-making authority. So it escalated. Co-host asserts control, tries to take the show to a different network entirely, and because there was a real, colorable claim to defend against, not a nuisance claim, this was a real deal, kind of a legal argument, the resolution took a year, more than a year, of negotiation and real expenses on both sides. Lawyers aren't cheap. So the detail that still bothers me most about that case is this. The fight was over how to split revenue that, because of the fight itself, never actually materialized. The show went dark for most of a year while everybody lawyered up. No revenue for either of them. During the exact window, they'd been arguing about how to divide whatever would have come in and how to get the revenue in the first place. And by the time the settlement was final, they weren't just splitting nothing. They were trying to rebuild, well, the one who ended up with the show was trying to rebuild an audience that had drifted away to other shows in the meantime. That's the real cost of an undocumented team relationship. It is rarely just the dispute in itself. It's the whole show going dark while the dispute plays out and everything that dwindling audience represents. And who owns that audience becomes a big factor. And it compounds in ways that are really easy to underestimate when you're starting out. Legal fees on both sides, months of decisions frozen because nobody can agree who has the authority to make them. A brand and an audience relationship that took years to build, sitting idle at the exact moment it was finally becoming valuable. None of that shows up as a single dramatic loss. It shows up as a slow bleed that's much larger by the time it's over than whatever the original disagreement was actually about. So this is what I want you to actually do. And it's a simple enough thing that you can do this week, right now. Make a list of everyone who has a recurring role in your show, touches it in any way. Every contractor, every co-host, every collaborator who shows up regularly enough that your audience would recognize their voice or their name or see the results of their work. For each person on that list, ask yourself honestly, do we have anything in writing? Does it address who owns what there's being created? Does it address decision-making authority or what happens to revenue or what happens if this relationship ends? For the people you've hired, the fix is usually pretty straightforward. A contract with an IP assignment clause added in to that contractor agreement that you're probably already using. That's a document you can put in place quickly, and it closes most of the gap. Now, for the people who joined organically, it's a little bit harder conversation because you're not drafting a new contractor agreement. You're formalizing a relationship that's existed informally, sometimes for years, sometimes with someone who you consider a friend. That conversation deserves care, and it deserves getting the terms right, because an agreement that's vague about ownership or decision-making could end up creating exactly the kind of ambiguity that led to the situation I described. This is exactly the kind of situation where I would tell you, get some real legal guidance, not because the conversation itself needs a lawyer in the room, but because getting the actual terms right in a way that holds up usually does. So approach it as a genuine conversation rather than a document you springing on someone. Here, sign this. What's each person's role actually going forward? How are the decisions to be made when the 2 or 3 of you don't agree? If sponsorship or other revenue comes in, how does it get split? And does that split reflect what each person actually contributes? What happens if one of you wants to walk away? What happens if one of you needs to be shown the door because you're just not doing the work? These are uncomfortable questions to raise with someone you've been informally working alongside for years. They're considerably more comfortable to raise now than in the middle of a dispute with lawyers already involved on all sides. Now, one last point on timing, because this matters more than people think. These disputes don't surface randomly. they almost always surface just as a show becomes valuable enough to fight over, when the sponsorship money starts flowing, when there's finally something worth disagreeing about, which means the easiest time to have this conversation is well before you reach that point, when there isn't really anything yet to fight over and the conversation is just a practical discussion about things rather than adversarial. So I'll leave you with this. A team isn't defined by the paycheck, it's defined by contribution. Anyone who has consistently helped to build what you have, whether you hired them, paid them, or not, could later believe, with real legal footing, that they own a piece of it. And protecting what you're building means documenting both kinds of relationships. And if you want them to own a piece of it, say so and make it happen. That matters too. Relationships, the ones that came with an invoice and the ones that just quietly grew into something real, is what you need to document in order to protect yourself. Now, I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer. This has been Legit Podcast Pro, and I'll see you next time. But first, head on over and get my blueprint, gordonfiremark.com/blueprint, and I'll see you real soon. Thanks.